Hello, my name is Scheherazade Hashbana, and in this presentation, we will be discussing attitudes and persuasion. What attitudes reveal about us? Well, first, let's start by defining what attitude is, which is a positive, negative, or mixed reaction to a person, object, or idea. For example, self esteem is considered as an attitude we hold about ourselves, or have an attraction to someone or something else is considered a positive attitude, while not having an attraction to someone or something else is considered a negative attitude. There are two things attitudes reveal about us as individuals. The first one is people differ in terms of their tendency in general to like or dislike things. The second is people differ not only in terms of whether they tend to like or dislike things, but in the extent to which, how quickly and how strongly they react. There are some ways to measure attitudes. For example, convert measures is an approach to the self-report problem that convert measures of attitudes that cannot be controlled, such as facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language. For example, sometimes we nod our head because we agree to something that somebody said, or sometimes we nod our head to be polite. These are certain attitudes that we demonstrate from our body language and facial expressions to show our attitude at that moment. There are instruments out there that can detect these uncontrollable behaviors that we demonstrate when we are emotional or have certain attitudes. For example, the facial electromyograph, also known as the EMG, which is an electric instrument that records facial muscle activity associated with emotions and attitudes. So, for example, there are certain areas in our faces that are linked to happiness and sadness as well. So, for example, we have the cheek muscles that is linked to happiness. Whenever we are happy, we demonstrate a smile, and that is affiliated with the cheek muscles. Versus when we are upset, distressed, we demonstrate facial patterns that are in our foreheads and our brow area. How attitudes are formed. Now, some researchers believe that this is an inherited characteristics that is deeply rooted in our genetic makeup, while others believe that it is a learned behavior that is formed through basic processes of learning. The link between attitudes and behaviors. Sociologist Richard Lapierre was the first to notice that attitudes and behaviors don't always go hand in hand. In his study in the early 1930s, during the height of the Great Depression, he took a young Chinese American couple on a 10,000-mile car trip, visiting 250 restaurants, campgrounds, and hotels across the United States. Although prejudice against Asians were widespread at the time, the couple was only refused service once. Yet, when Lapierre wrote back to the places that they visited and asked if they would accept Chinese customers, more than 90% of them returned to answer, and their answer was no. Lapierre's study was seriously flawed. It included some limitations that were questionable. For example, one of the limitations was he measured attitudes several months after his trip. During this time, the attitudes may have changed. He also did not know whether those who responded to the letter were the same people who had greeted the couple in person. Lapierre's findings puzzled much researchers. This caused them to identify the conditions under which attitudes and behaviors are correlated. It was concluded that attitudes significantly and substantially predict future behaviors. This brings us to the theory of planned behavior, which is the theory that attitudes towards a specific behavior combine with a subjective norm and perceived control to influence a person's actions. Persuasion. Persuasion is the process of which attitudes are changed. Now, you may see this from politicians who are running for office and are trying to persuade the general population to favor them on election day. And you may also see this from lawyers who are trying to persuade the jurors to favor them in the decision making. Now, there are two routes to persuasion, there is the central route and there is the peripheral route. The central route is the process of which a person thinks carefully about a communication and is influenced by the strength of the argument. Now, there was three ways on which you can go about this. Carl Hovland and colleagues stated that the persuasive message to have influence, the recipients of the message must learn its contents and be motivated to accept it. McGeer then added, use its extension to explain the surprising finding that a recipient's self esteem and intelligence are unrelated to persuasion. And Anthony Greenwald argued that persuasion required a third intermediate step, which is elaboration. Now, the peripheral route is the process by which a person does not think carefully about a communication and is influenced instead of superficial cues. These are the type of people that will change their attitude simply because they know that an argument has majority support. Here's a chart that demonstrates the two routes of persuasion. Now, the source is a pretty important step in order for you to catch the attention and draw that attention. And there are two attributes for the source, which is credibility and likability. So, for example, with credibility, you may find yourself believing CNN or Fox News or HLN before you will believe a tabloid magazine, even if both are spreading the exact same news. You would find that CNN would be more credible and a more reliable source than a tabloid magazine would. Along with the source, the message, on the other hand, is a pretty important part. With the peripheral route to persuasion, audiences are influenced heavily, maybe too heavily, by various sources of characteristics. On the central route of persuasion, what matters most is whether a scientist's theory is supported by the data or rather a company has a sound product. These types of messages are information strategies, message discrepancy, fear appeals, positive emotions, and subliminal messages. Now, before relaying the message out, of course, the communicator has to make sure he or she take account of who the audience is and how to get the audience. So, for example, first thing we're going to talk about is the need for cognition, which is a personality variable that distinguishes people on the basis of how much they enjoy effortful cognitive activity. And people who are high rather than low in their needs for cognition like to work on hard problems, search for clues, make fine distinctions, and analyze situations. Here's an example of a graph that shows the need for cognition. It is the need for cognition scale that shows if you are high or low in the need for cognition. Next, you got the self-monitoring. Now, there are two types of self monitors. You have the high self monitors and you have the low self monitors. So the high self monitors regulate their behavior from one situation to another out of concern for public self presentation, while the low self monitors are less image conscious and have according to their own beliefs, values, and preference. And then you have the regulatory fit, which are the people who are more likely to be influenced by messages that fit their frame of mind and the feel right um, area. Lastly, you have the forewarning and resistance. And this is when our attitudes or values come under attack, when we succumb to the challenge and change the attitude, or we can resist it and maintain the attitude. When we believe that somebody is trying to change our attitudes or manipulate us in any kind of way, this raises a psychological reactance, and this is a red flag for us. Cognitive dissonance theory, the classic version, is considered the theory holding that inconsistent cognitions arouse psychological tension that people become motivated to reduce. An example of this is when you say that you are in a diet and you go full force on a ice cream or pizza or anything that is not good for your diet. Now, this is an example of inconsistency in that conflicts that you already committed yourself to a course of action, yet you realize that that action is inconsistent with your attitude. Cognitive dissonance theory, a new look. There are four steps necessary for both the arousal and reduction of dissonance. The first one is the attitude. Uh, Disruptant behavior must produce unwanted negative consequences. Two, feeling of personal responsibility for the unpleasant outcome of behavior. Three, the psychological arousal. And four, a person must also make an attribution for that arousal to his or her own belief. Below is a chart that demonstrates the steps one by one. Here are some alternative routes to self-persuasion. Here is a list of theories. The first theory is the self-perception theory, which we don't always have firsthand knowledge of our own attitudes. Second is impression management theory, which says that what matters is not a motive to be consistent, but a motive to appear consistent. And the self esteem theories is the act that arouses dissonance, do so because they threaten the self concept, making the person feel guilty, dishonest, or hypocritical. Cultural influences on cognitive dissonance. In the Western culture, individuals are expected to make decisions that are consistent with their personal attitudes and to make those decisions free from outside influences. While in the um, East Asian cultures, however, individuals are also expected to make decisions that benefit their in group members and to take the well being of others into account in making those decisions. Thank you. This concludes the presentation.